Hello, Ann Dadisman again to share with you yet another story. This one comes from my childhood. I was fortunate enough to get to live in two wonderful states, through actually three wonderful states as a child. But most of the years, my education years, were spent in either Maryland or Pennsylvania. And I lived in three very small little communities: Springs, Pennsylvania, Salisbury, Pennsylvania, and Grantsville, Maryland. Now, it was in Grantsville that the building existed, which was responsible for our living in any of those three towns, and that was the Flying Cross Shirt Factory. My mother had learned to sew commercially when Eleanor Roosevelt opened a shirt factory in Preston County as part of her husband's New Deal Homestead Act. And then that facility closed, and she did some other things for a while, but she discovered that she was indeed an accomplished seamstress. And so she worked in a shirt factory for much of the rest of her life. Grantsville was a perfect place to grow up. You could get a Coke and a bag of potato chips for 25 cents. You could get a chocolate bar at the little store across the street for 3 cents. You could visit the Ruth Enlow Traveling Library every week and get a stack of books to keep you busy. You could walk to school. You could visit, annually the carnival would come to town. But it was the shirt factory that was at the heart of our life in many ways. Josephine sat at her sewing machine. Whir, whir, whir. The motor ran as she expertly stitched the last side of a pocket on the shirt front. She snipped at the thread and tossed it into the bin at the front of her machine just as the buzzer sounded. That buzzer indicated that the shift was over for the day. With a sweet smile, she turned off her machine, the light and the machine itself. She stood up and she pushed her chair underneath. She stretched a bit. She arched her long torso and her long legs. And she picked up her sweater, her thermos, and her brown paper lunch bag. She carried those each day to the shirt factory. And then she smiled, for she realized not only was it the end of shift, but it was the end of a Friday shift. And so the weekend stretched out before her. Time with her husband and her little girl. It did not bother her that this was Friday and that meant laundry. She was happy to do that. She had fixed up an easy dinner the night before, and she was ready for the weekend. She began to walk when then she suddenly remembered it was also the last Friday of the month, and so the sales table would be open. The Flying Cross Shirt Factory offered employees an opportunity to buy odds and ends, maybe the end of a bolt of fabric, or buttons, thread, sometimes zippers, sometimes lace, items that could be used to make doll clothes or clothes for her little girl, and occasionally something for herself. She thought she would stop by. She had a few pennies in her pocket that perhaps she would be able to find something to carry home. So she was headed toward that sales table when she heard a voice behind her, "Josephine, Josephine." And she turned to look, and there was her line boss. Her first thought was, what have I done wrong? He had timed her that day, for she worked piece rate, which meant that her paycheck was determined by how many pockets she could set in a given period of time. She had that day beat her best time, which meant that she would get a little advance, a little more on her paycheck than she had had before. and that was always good. And then she thought, what have I done wrong? Why would he want to talk to me? But he was smiling, and so her racing heart calmed down, and she walked back to where he stood waiting for her. He had a parcel in his hands. It was something wrapped in brown paper and tied with common cord. He said, Josephine, I have something I want to talk to you about. This sample of fabric has come in, and I don't want to put it on the odds and ends table, and it's the only one of its kind. I've watched how hard you work, and I want to give it to you. But it does come with some strings. And she looked at him, puzzled. He said, you must make something for yourself from this fabric. You can't use it for anyone else. She thought, if it's fabric, I can make something for my little girl. But it was clear that he was expecting her to do something else. And so she said, all right, I will. I will make something for myself. She said, thank you so much. So she didn't go to the odds and ends table, but she hurried on home, and she laid that fairly sizable little package up on the shelf. And she went about her Friday evening duties. Later, when the house was quiet, when her little girl was fast asleep in bed, and her husband was reading in the living room, she untied the cord, rolled it up into a little ball, and placed it in the drawer, for nothing was wasted, not in that house. And then she began to stretch out the fabric on the kitchen table. She caught her breath. It was the most beautiful, deep, royal blue wool she had ever seen. She walked around the table with her tape measure. She measured and she thought. She thought and she measured. She began to hum. And then she said, yes, yes, there will be enough for it. And only then did she begin to fold and to pin, to cut, to stitch, and to snip. Hours passed. Her husband went to bed, and she continued to work. The clock in the kitchen said midnight, and she continued to work. Then it said 3, and she was still sewing. She was snipping. She was stitching. She was cutting. She was sewing. When the first rays of the morning light began to shine through the kitchen window, with a deep sigh, she made that last snip and laid down the scissors. She picked up what she'd been working on, and she tried it on for the first time in its completed form. Oh, it fit perfectly. It was a coat. It was a long coat. Now, Josephine was a tall woman, nearly 6 feet tall. Long coats were hard to come by, but this one came down below her calf. Oh, the sleeves fell all the way to her wrist bone, and there was a large cuff that folded back. The pockets were deep. She could put her hands in them, even with gloves on, and know that they would be warm as she walked to work every day, for Grantsville's winters were indeed cold. And the collar, why, she could tie a scarf about her head and then pull up the collar and wrap the scarf yet around it to protect her neck from the wind and the snow. The buttons were large and perfect, all 4 of them down the front. Indeed, this wool coat would protect her against Grantsville's terrible winter storms. She wore that coat season after season, and it did its job. And then one day she looked at it and she said, "Oh, you poor old coat, I've worn you out." And indeed she had. Why, the elbows had tatters, and the buttons would not stay buttoned, for the buttonholes were weak. The collar was still pretty, but the hem of the coat sagged in many places. And so that Friday night, when the work for the week was done, Josephine laid the coat out on the kitchen table. She got her tape measure and she began to walk around the table, thinking and measuring. She began to hum an old hymn. And finally she said, "Yes, I think there is. I think there's just enough." And only then did she begin to fold and to cut, to snip away all the parts and pieces that were completely worn away. She began to refashion, to rebuild. She worked late into the night and then into the early morning hours, but it was still dark when she snipped that final thread and laid down her scissors for the last time. And she tried on her new jacket. Oh, now, the jacket came just below the waist. The sleeves were long. They came all the way again to the wrist bone, but there was no fancy cuff. The collar was quite modest, but there was a collar. The pockets just deep enough to carry a bit of change, or maybe something else. And she had redone the buttonholes and reused those 4 buttons, which were much closer together now, but they made a fine jacket. And she said to herself, "Oh, this jacket will keep me warm when the autumn winds blow here in Grantsville." And they did. They kept her warm, that jacket. She wore it season after season. And finally one day she took it off the hanger and she looked at it and she said, "Oh, you poor old thing, I've worn you out." That Friday, when the work was done, she laid the jacket down on the kitchen table. Oh, indeed, there was not much left to work with. There were holes, there were broken threads, there were sagging places, but she was sure she could make something of it. And so she measured and she thought, and she thought and she measured. And she began to hum again. And she said, "Yes, there is. There will be enough, just enough for me to make this." And only then did she begin to cut. She cut and she pinned. She stitched. She snipped. And about midnight, or maybe a little before, she finished that last snip and lay down her shears, and this time she tried on. It was a vest. Now this vest came just to her waist, not even a fraction below. It had no sleeves, it had no collar, and it had no buttons. But she thought, it will still keep my back warm when the spring breezes become too brisk. I can wear it beneath my sweater and I will stay warm. And she did. She wore it for season after season. And then one day, she looked at it and she said, "You poor old thing. This wool fabric has served me so well, first as a long coat, and then a jacket, and now finally a vest. But you're worn out." And yet, that Friday night, she laid that vest on the kitchen table and she walked around and she thought, what can I make of this? For indeed, there was really nothing left of it that was usable. It was stretched, it was torn, it was tattered, it was weak, it was worn. She walked around, this time without her measuring tape, and she said, "Yes, I know. I know what I can do." And then she sang just a line from an old favorite song. She said, "I know how I can use it now. There's just enough left for a story." Thank you.